and under stress, emotional pressure, or even heightened suggestibility, this can happen unintentionally. It's suggested that this does not come out in the person's normal speaking voice. The voice may be whispered or produced deep in the throat, making it difficult for the brain to locate where the sound is coming from. In an echoing kitchen filled with hard surfaces and a metal stove, acting as a resonant chamber, a quiet or altered voice could easily seem as if it were coming from an object rather than a person. Crucially, according to this theory, the individual producing the sound may genuinely believe the voice is external. Disassociation and social reinforcement could play a major role. And once others react with fear or surprise, the situation can quickly become a shared reality that reinforces the behaviour. However, it's worth pointing out that I could find very little on this phenomenon online. Most references to it seem to cycle back to the Zaragoza Goblin case, so I'm not sure that this is a widely proven phenomenon. It does, however, link us to another case we've covered before, that I'm sure we'll talk about later. According to one resident, as a test, the squatter was sent away on an errand to a nearby lake to keep her away from the building for the day. However, the voice continued to talk. But still, the psychiatrist believed she was responsible. To quote from the New York Times article that came out later, "The girl was allowed to return home because it was stated she was quite unaware of her gift of ventriloquism, or that she had been impersonating the ghost. The examining magistrate declared that this was a genuine psychiatric phenomenon, produced only in certain circumstances, but he did not divulge what those circumstances are. Many spiritualists now maintain the girl was acting as a medium for some spirit, and there really was a ghost after all." The former occupant of the haunted apartment protests the investigation was not completed, and points out that the voice was heard on several occasions when the servant was absent from the kitchen. While they were trying to put this whole thing to bed by blaming the maid, many of the investigators were less convinced and proceeded with their investigation. This led the whole thing to take on a much more serious tone. The army was brought in to evacuate the residents. They cut all methods of communication to the building and guarded the entire area. The governor asked the media to play their part as well, demanding a full blackout of coverage of the events until the investigation was completed. The building was once again searched from top to bottom, and no sign of how this was being done could be found. A barrier had been set up around the entire property, meaning no one could enter without permission. The police finally reached the apartment and walked into the kitchen. During this search, the voice had not been heard, and the feeling was that this only reinforced the idea that one of the residents was responsible. One of the police officers called out, asking if it was still there. Then it began. A low, drawn-out cackle. It began to shout an endless stream of insults at the police, as though it had been holding all of this in, until they were willing to acknowledge it. Then it yelled a vicious threat, aimed at the Palazon family. It said, "I will kill them. All of them." But after that sudden outburst, there was silence once again. The police hung around, but after 48 hours of no activity, the residents were allowed back into the property, and the police withdrew. A number of residents gathered in the Palazon's kitchen to discuss whether it was truly over. Then they heard it. "Cowards," it yelled. "Cowards. Here I am." It was mocking their attempts at getting help. There was no way, seemingly, to stop it. By December, and after a month of chaos on its streets, the governor put all the blame on the only suspect they had, the squalor. The explanation of unconscious ventriloquism was put out as an official statement. Pasquale denied it, but very quickly she was portrayed as the villain in all of this, with many locals believing that she was behind the chaos the city had been facing over the past weeks. She was relieved of her duties and left Zaragoza. But reports of the activity had happened while she was away from the building, and reports were still made after she had left. Although due to the media quickly moving on, now that it had all been apparently debunked, very little information exists about these later instances. After 2 months of laughter, threats and taunts, the voice suddenly just one day stopped. No one was sure what had changed, what had caused it to leave. Apparently never to be heard from again. The building was demolished many years ago, but in its place a new, more modern structure was built. A sign on the outside reads, Duende, the name of this new building. A strange monument to an even stranger story. But it appears at least no further activity has been reported there. The residents were able to move on with their lives. It had been a strange period, but despite the at times violent threats coming from the voice, no one had been hurt or seriously affected. All except for Pasquale, who was apparently haunted by the story the rest of her life. Despite moving away, people recognised her from the papers and constantly asked her about the goblins and her apparent, impressive ventriloquism skills. To begin with, she denied it over and over, but eventually she just gave up, becoming a recluse and living out her days alone. This 2-month incident had ruined her entire life. But many years later, a reporter was able to track her down, and to his surprise, was willing to give a short interview. When he asked where the voice had come from, she simply said, "The wall." So what really happened? This one is genuinely fascinating. Before we get too into it, let's just discuss the sources of where this information has come from. There are some great write-ups on this case, including from Atlas Obscura. Most of these articles seem to take their information from the Times of London, which provided daily English language updates on the case as it was playing out, but there are Spanish language news articles available. It's worth noting that the press was clearly having fun with the story, and while we shouldn't dismiss the events, they clearly are looking at it through a slightly comedic lens. There is also the more recently produced short documentary on the case that I will link in the description. This contains an interview with AdachiRei, the son of the building's owner, who was present for many of the events. Let's start with the official explanation, the unconscious ventriloquism of Pasquale. Where this becomes tricky is that we're dealing with second-hand information. Based on the story that is available to us, this official explanation seems ridiculous. How was this young girl laughing so loudly that it could be heard multiple floors away, to such an extreme that it made the residents leave their homes? How was she able to continue the voice, despite not being in the building? How did she develop such an incredible talent? But of course, we could be missing details here. Maybe the idea that she wasn't present at times was an invention by those interviewed at the time, and that has simply been treated as fact. Not that they were deliberately misleading the press, but just mistaking themselves. There are benefits to having so many witnesses, but at times that can make it harder to know which recountings are the most accurate. There may be details that we don't have, evidence that she was in fact responsible